Welcome to this Killik Explains Finance video. This time around it's part 3 of my first time property buying basics. Part 1 and part 2 are out there and available. This is part 3. So what is part 3 all about? The process and common pitfalls. So I'm going to summarise what is quite a lengthy, tortuous and annoying process in a few stages and point out 1 or 2 things to watch out for and 1 or 2 ways to make it a bit easier. So I'm going to put this into 3 baskets if you like. Stage 1, find a property and get an offer accepted. Stage 2, carry out searches, get a survey organised and get your mortgage approved so that stage 3 can take place, exchange of contracts and completion. And all of these have slightly different things to worry about as we go along. So let's take a look at these now. So, offer and acceptance, stage 1. Now, I'm assuming you've found the property you want. Here's the point, you put an offer in. Now, that offer could be, as it says here, above, at, or below the asking price. That'll depend on the market, depend on how many people are fighting to get the same property. Why would it be above the asking price? That's the price marketed, if you like, by the seller. Well, if it's really popular and you're in an aggressive market, sometimes you even have to put sealed bids in and guess what price will be needed to get the property. Now, that in England and Wales hasn't been the case for a while. Since July 2018, the market's cooled quite a bit. So, in a lot of cases, people will be advised to put an offer in slightly below the asking price. Whether it gets accepted, another matter entirely. Now, gesundering, just so you know, this is a part of the objective is to do a jargon tour here, is the idea that a seller might lower their offer, even having had it accepted just prior to exchange of contracts. Don't recommend it. It's not good practice, but because offers are not legally binding, acceptance doesn't even make the whole thing legally binding, sellers can do just that to try and force a cheaper deal through. Now, acceptance. This is not a guarantee at this point. There is no contract at this point. So this is the frustrating thing. Some people think just because an offer's been accepted doesn't mean you'll get the property. All right, gazumping is where another buyer subsequently beats your offer, and that can happen. So you think, well, I've had an offer accepted. Well, if a better one comes along, you may get dumped as a buyer. And gazanging is where a seller pulls out because prices are rising rapidly. So they say, well, your offer was good a couple of months ago, but not so keen anymore. So there is a reason basically to get a move on. Try and get this process, which can be a bit tortuous, as tight as possible. I'll give you some tips on how to do that at the end. Now, searches and surveys. So stage 2, so you've had an offer accepted. Quite a lot of work to do now. Searches. This is a request from the buyer's solicitor. So a lot of the onus is on the buyer. It's caveat emptor, buyer beware, so do your homework. So the buyer's solicitor, more about them in a moment, will carry out searches with the local authority to determine your building controls issues, schemes, actions and so on. Is a railway about to be opened 100 yards from the property? Is there any contamination in the area that you couldn't see or know about as the buyer just walking through the door? It's all important stuff. Drainage, is the property connected to the sewers? Environmental, as I mentioned, so really, really important, and these are done through the local authority and they take a little bit of time. Surveys then are different. So this is where basically as a buyer, you are carrying out your own survey via obviously a surveyor on the property itself. Now, there are 3 levels in theory, but only the 3rd one is actually a genuine survey in a sense. So you've got the mortgage valuation. Now, the mortgage company that's lending you money to buy this property, assuming there is one, which there will be in most cases, they will do their own valuation just to establish that the thing that they're lending against is worth at least as much as the loan. But don't rely on that too heavily as a buyer. There are home buyers reports and full structural surveys. Now, you pay more for these as you move down the list, if you like. They get more and more expensive. Home buyers reports are okay on the whole for straightforward properties, so modern flats and houses may be built in the last 50 years, let's say, where you don't have any specific concerns. But for anything else, it's going to cost you more money, quite a bit more money, like double or more. I would go for a full structural survey personally. Got any concerns about the property, all right, or you're buying something that's relatively old, or you're buying a house, frankly, almost in any state, full structural surveys are quite worth doing. But, as I'll summarise in a moment, they're pricier. Now that takes a bit of time too, all right? That can't be done just overnight. So, now let's look at mortgage applications. As part of this process, you want to have got this kicked off earlier than now, but this is now we're going to start to wrap this up because you're going to need the money on the table soon. So an approval in principle, get that going early in the process. This is where you approach a lender. They do some basic checks, all right, decide how much they're prepared to lend. They're not extending the loan at this point. They're just saying, yeah, we would in principle be prepared to lend someone like you this amount of money, and they usually keep that open for say 90 days. all right, and then you'll need to reapply. And that's worth doing early because you don't want to be scrambling around doing all this legwork just at the point where you want to get things moving, get on with the property transaction, get to exchange your contracts. Now, the mortgage application, so you've found a property and you now want a specific amount, the lender will now hammer through much more paperwork, go through pay slips, satisfy themselves that you're good for the money and so on, good for the loan. All right, they'll do a valuation to make sure they're happy with the value of the property that they're lending against. All right, and they'll confirm, hopefully, their willingness to lend, plus any terms and conditions that have been attached. More on that in part 1 of this series, by the way. But that's quite important. Get this done early and then hope that the lender, and some are better than others, will get you through this stage reasonably painlessly. Now, exchange and completion. This is the bit you're aiming at, really. This is where you want to get to. Exchange of contracts makes the whole thing binding. So all formalities need to have been out of the way and done by the time your solicitors, that is one for the buyer, one for the seller, actually arrange exchange of contracts. That binds everybody in. So you want your searches finished, queries resolved, there'll be a list of queries potentially raised by the buyer's solicitor, and documentation prepared. A non-refundable deposit, 10 to 15% of the purchase price maybe, all negotiable, is paid over into a secure account by the buyer, held on the seller's behalf by their solicitor usually, and the purchase is legally binding. Now, you may not actually have the keys to the front door just yet. That's called completion. Can be done at the same time, but there may be reasons why the seller needs a bit of time to organise moving out and so on. Stamp duty's got to be paid within 30 days. All right. Funds are transferred to the seller. Title deeds are updated at that point. The property is legally registered as yours. You get the keys and can arrange to move in. So there can be a gap, can be a month's gap between these two stages. You're aiming to get to the right-hand side, but you'll breathe a sigh of relief and probably pop the fizz when you get here, because highly unlikely it'll fail at this point. Now, this is something to bear in mind. If you're thinking about buying a property, it's an expensive old business, and cutting corners can be a mistake. It's tempting, but I'll show you why. So things as a buyer you'll need to pay for. There's mortgage arrangement fees, surveys and searches. That's all going to come out of the buyer's pocket potentially. There are solicitors' fees, more about that in a moment. Now the seller will have to pay some of those too, buyer as well, and the stamp duty, again paid by the buyer. So as a buyer, you need all of the money lined up to cover all this stuff before you start the process really. How much are we talking? Well, these are all guidelines, but mortgage arrangement fees on certain types of mortgages can be up to £2,000. Solicitors can charge up to £1,500. Now I wouldn't economise too much on solicitors, more about that in a moment. Searches at the local authority can add, say, £300, and a full structural survey could be around the £1,000 mark. Expensive, but often worth the money. And then, of course, there's removal and redecoration costs when you finally get to the end of the process. Stamp duty can be a fair old whack. On a property costing £500,000, for example, you hand over, in addition to everything on the left, £15,000 to the government, and that's non-refundable. You don't get that back. And that's because stamp duty, land tax, works on a sort of sliding scale in tranches according to the value of the property that you're buying. All right, so quite a few things to budget for as the buyer. Now a few tips. Set a budget and stick to it. All right, when you're looking around for property, have a budget in mind, because otherwise what can happen, especially in a hot market, is you'll get drawn into overpaying, or you'll go for a property that actually realistically you can't afford, and there's always going to be a nicer, bigger one that's out of your range. Don't scrimp too much on surveys or solicitors' fees. If in doubt, go for the more expensive survey, not the cheaper one. That's purely my advice. And with solicitors, you want somebody who can do this on your behalf. Chase, chase, chase. Chase the other side, the estate agents. Chase the local authority. Get the surveys, or help you to get the surveys done and to analyse the results. Get queries answered by the other side. And for that, you'll need a decent solicitor. So just be careful going too cheap and cheerful on that side. Lots of ground covered there, summarised a big process, so it's editor@killik.com with any questions. And if you want to see part 1 and part 2, then it's killik.com/learn.